200,000 people applied for a one-way trip to Mars. Not a round trip, one way. They read every word of what that meant and they signed anyway. Today we find out what they understood that most people still don't, and why the physics, the biology and the math all point to the same place. Whoever goes to Mars is already home. Now let's begin. In 2012, a group of NASA engineers sat in a closed meeting room and finished running the complete numbers on a crewed Mars mission. Not a concept, not a vision document. A full technical plan covering every variable that determines whether human beings survive a round trip to another planet. When they reached the final line of the spreadsheet, the probability of the crew returning to Earth alive was below 20%. They closed the folders. Nobody published it. The reason was not a lack of funding, not a failure of rocket technology, not a shortage of political will. The reason was simpler and more absolute than any of those things. Physics, biology and mathematics had been added together honestly, and the answer they produced was the same every time the crew would not be coming home. What makes this harder to absorb is that none of it was secret. The numbers were never hidden. They appear in peer-reviewed journals, in papers presented at aerospace conferences, in technical literature that circulates openly within the engineering community. The people who spend their careers designing rockets and calculating mission trajectories have understood the situation clearly for decades. The numbers simply never made it to the front page because the front page was not ready for what they said. Then, in 2016, Elon Musk stood on a stage in Guadalajara and presented the architecture that would become Starship. The room filled with a particular electricity that appears when someone says something audacious and means it completely. The slides were detailed. The timelines were ambitious. The ambition was genuine. The audience responded with sustained applause. Nobody asked about the last slide, the one about getting back. This asymmetry is not unique to SpaceX. It runs through NASA's public communications, through the roadmaps published by every space agency that has ever placed Mars in its mission statement, through decades of announcements and press conferences and carefully worded vision statements. The language describing the journey to Mars is vivid and specific. The language describing the return tends to soften and become approximate at exactly the moment it should become most precise, because precision leads somewhere, but the conversation is not prepared to go. The plainest version of the truth is this: there is no currently funded, technically detailed engineering credible plan for a crewed Mars round trip within the next 30 years that the people who actually build and fly rockets consider realistic. There are proposals. There are architectural concepts that function on paper under assumptions that have never been tested at operational scale. But a plan in the sense of something with a real budget attached and engineers who genuinely trust the numbers does not exist for the return journey the way it exists for the outbound leg. This is not pessimism. It is arithmetic. The universe does not adjust its difficulty based on how much humanity wants something. It does not make room for ambition or political momentum or the force of collective optimism. Physics applies to everyone equally without sentiment, and when it is applied honestly to the problem of returning from Mars across 5 decades of serious mission planning, by team after team working independently, it keeps producing the same answer that those engineers found in 2012. They already knew. The question is not whether their numbers were accurate. They were. The deeper question is why the gap between what the engineering community knows and what the public conversation reflects has remained so wide for so long, and what it costs to keep pretending that gap does not exist. Part of the answer is simply how human beings relate to stories of exploration. The imagination is drawn naturally to departure, to the journey outward to the arrival. The return is assumed, treated as the inevitable conclusion, rather than the part that requires examination. When people picture Mars, they picture the moment of first contact with the surface, the boot print in ochre dust, the voice transmission crossing the void back to a listening Earth. The mind stops there because that is where the story feels complete. For an engineer, that is precisely where the hardest part of the problem begins. The other part of the answer is that stating the truth plainly sounds uncomfortably close to surrender, and nobody building the future of human spaceflight wants to be the voice of surrender. So the return gets a mention, gets a slide, gets a line in the executive summary, and the conversation moves forward to the portions of the plan that are easier to frame as achievable. The gap accumulates quietly year after year, until it becomes large enough to require a full reckoning to cross. The pages that follow are an attempt at that reckoning, not to argue that Mars is beyond reach because it is not to argue that human beings will never stand on its surface, because they almost certainly will within the lifetimes of people alive right now, but to follow honestly without softening the destination, the question the Guadalajara audience never pressed hard enough. How do they come home if the smartest people in aerospace engineering have known the answer to this question for decades, and the answer keeps pointing in the same uncomfortable direction? Why do we still hear about plans to send humans to Mars and back, as though the return trip were simply a logistical detail waiting to be worked out? To understand why, we need to start with a number, not distance, not cost, time. And that number will permanently change the way you think about what the word journey actually means. On the day you leave Earth, Mars is at its closest point in the current orbital cycle, roughly 54 million kilometers away. That distance is difficult to hold in the mind in any visceral sense, so translate it into something more immediate. Light covers 54 million kilometers in approximately 3 minutes. A radio signal sent from mission control, the instant your engines ignite, reaches Mars about 3 minutes later. By the standards of interplanetary space, you are leaving for a neighbor. But here is what happens during the journey itself. 7 to 9 months pass, while your spacecraft follows its elliptical transfer arc through the inner solar system. During every one of those months, both planets continue moving. They never pause. Earth advances along its yearly orbit. Mars pushes forward along its own wider, slower path. The alignment that made your departure window possible, the specific geometric relationship between two planets that allowed an efficient trajectory between them, closed while you were still in transit. By the time you descend through the thin Martian atmosphere and touch down on the rust-colored surface, the planets have moved into entirely different positions relative to each other. The distance between them is now growing larger every day. Orbital mechanics is not a matter of opinion. It is not a design parameter that engineers can optimize away with a better rocket or a larger fuel budget. Earth completes one orbit of the Sun in 365 days. Mars requires 687 days to travel the same loop because its orbit is wider and it moves more slowly. The relationship between those two orbital periods produces a favorable alignment once every 26 months. That window, the brief period when the geometry allows a fuel-efficient transit between the planets, is called the launch window. It governs every serious Mars mission plan ever drawn up, and it will continue to govern them regardless of how propulsion technology develops, because the orbital periods of planets are determined by the mass of the Sun and the distance of their orbits, neither of which engineering can touch. When you arrive at Mars, that window has closed. The next window, allowing an efficient return to Earth, will open approximately 500 days after your arrival. Not 500 days from when you departed Earth. 500 days from when you landed on Mars. There is no shortcut through this interval. A spacecraft attempting to force a return outside the optimal window would need so much additional propellant to compensate for the unfavorable geometry that the mass requirements become practically impossible to meet a problem the next. Part of this story examines in full. You wait. The orbital calendar is not subject to revision. The arithmetic of a minimum duration round trip is worth stating precisely. 7 to 9 months of outbound transit, plus 14 to 16 months waiting on the Martian surface for the return window, plus 7 to 9 months of return transit. The total is approximately 3 years. That figure represents the absolute floor, the best achievable outcome, under conditions of perfect mechanical function across every system for the entire duration of the mission. The comparison that gives this figure its true weight is a simple one. The Apollo 11 mission lasted 8 days from launch to splashdown, 8 days from the moment the Saturn V cleared the launch tower at Kennedy Space Center to the moment the command module settled into the Pacific Ocean. The longest continuous human spaceflight in history belongs to cosmonaut Valery Polyakov, who spent 437 days aboard the Mir space station between January of 1994 and March of 1995. That record has stood for 3 decades because no mission has required anyone to approach it. A minimum duration Mars round trip requires nearly 3 times that figure under conditions that are incomparably more demanding than low Earth orbit, and that estimate holds only if nothing goes wrong at any point during 3 years of continuous operations. Now, consider what happens when something does go wrong. If a technical failure on Mars causes the crew to miss the departure window, even by a margin too small to correct the mission does not extend by weeks. It extends by 26 months. The window that just closed will not reopen until the planets complete another cycle of their orbital dance. A 3-year mission becomes a 5-year mission automatically, with no intermediate option available and no negotiation possible. There is no standby slot, there is no contingency departure. Celestial mechanics does not provide exceptions for crews in difficulty. The practical meaning of this for emergency response deserves to be stated without any softening. The International Space Station orbits at an altitude of approximately 400 kilometers. When a serious emergency occurs aboard the station, a Soyuz evacuation vehicle can have the crew on the ground within approximately 3 hours. That capability has been exercised repeatedly in the station's operational history and remains continuously available to every crew that serves aboard it. Earth is always hours away. For a crew on Mars, that relationship between emergency and response does not exist in any form that resembles rescue, as the word is normally understood. The minimum transit time from Earth to Mars is 7 to 9 months in a single direction. Before a rescue mission could begin that journey, it would need to be designed, prepared, fueled, and launched, a process requiring months of lead time under ideal conditions. Any acute crisis that develops on the Martian surface, any situation requiring outside intervention within days or weeks, will have resolved itself long before a rescue ship could cover even a fraction of the distance between the planets. The crew manages with what they brought, or they do not manage. This places a Mars crew in a risk category that has no precedent anywhere in the history of human spaceflight. Every crew aboard the International Space Station operates with the knowledge that Earth is 3 hours away. Every Apollo crew, including the crew of Apollo 13, during its near-catastrophic oxygen tank failure, retained the option of using lunar gravity to curve their trajectory back toward Earth within days. The door home was always within reach, even when it was not certain they would make it through. The Mars crew has no version of that door. When the launch window closes behind them on departure day, the universe locks it. The key turns on a 26-month cycle, and the lock does not respond to emergencies. Have you ever considered that the thing standing between a Mars crew and their return home is not a failure of engineering or a shortage of funding, but simply the movement of 2 planets around a star, following laws that have not changed, since the solar system formed 4.5 billion years. But if the orbital calendar is the cage that holds a Mars crew in place, the rocket equation is what makes the cage so extraordinarily difficult to escape. It is what experienced aerospace engineers have described as a mathematical monster, and it will show you exactly why carrying enough fuel for the return trip is not simply a matter of packing more carefully before you leave. Imagine you are preparing to climb a mountain. The climb will take several days, so you pack food. But food has weight, and carrying more weight makes the climb harder, which means you burn more calories, which means you need more food to sustain the effort. But more food adds more weight, which increases the caloric demand further, which requires still more food. The loop does not grow in a straight line. It compounds on itself, each addition triggering a requirement larger than the one before it, spiraling outward in a way that quickly escapes intuition entirely. This is with engineering precision, and without any simplification that changes the underlying truth. Exactly what happens to a rocket when you increase the velocity it needs to achieve. The relationship between desired speed and required fuel is not proportional, it is exponential. This mathematical reality was formalized in 1897 by a Russian schoolteacher named Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, working in a small provincial town with nothing but pencil, paper, and an extraordinary mind. What he derived became known as the rocket equation, and it has governed every serious calculation about spaceflight ever since. Engineers who spend careers working with it describe it in terms that are not hyperbolic. It is genuinely brutal in what it demands. To understand why Mars is so fundamentally different from the Moon, start with what the Moon required. The lunar module that carried Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin to the surface of the Moon and back weighed approximately 15 metric tons fully fueled. Of that total mass, roughly 2,300 kilograms was the propellant needed to lift the ascent stage off the lunar surface and reach orbit where it could rendezvous with the command module waiting above. The moon's gravitational pull is 1/6 of Earth's, which means escaping it requires relatively modest velocity. The math was demanding but achievable. The mission flew and it worked. Mars presents a problem that is different not in degree but in fundamental character. Mars has a gravitational field equal to 38% of Earth's. That sounds manageable until you work through what it actually demands of a rocket. To escape the Martian surface and reach orbit, a spacecraft must accelerate to approximately 3,600 meters per second. That figure is more than double the velocity required to escape the moon, and because the rocket equation is exponential rather than linear, doubling the required velocity does not double the fuel requirement. Depending on the specific design of the vehicle and the efficiency of its engines, the propellant mass required can increase by a factor of 4, 6, or even 10 compared to a lunar equivalent. The engineering studies that have worked through this in detail arrive at numbers that are difficult to present without causing a moment of complete stillness. To lift a crewed vehicle from the Martian surface to Mars orbit, the first step of the journey home requires approximately 40,000 to 70,000 kilograms of propellant. That figure covers only the ascent from the surface to orbit. The subsequent burns needed to leave Mars orbit, travel across interplanetary space, and slow down enough to enter Earth's atmosphere require additional propellant on top of that. When the complete return journey is accounted for honestly, the total propellant mass demanded is staggering by any standard of comparison. Here is where the plan-killing problem emerges with full clarity. All of that propellant has to come from somewhere. There are only two options. You bring it from Earth, or you produce it on Mars. If you bring it from Earth, the rocket equation applies to that decision as well, and it applies without mercy. Every kilogram of propellant you want to have available on the Martian surface must be launched off Earth, accelerated out of Earth's substantial gravity, well transported across interplanetary space, decelerated into Mars orbit, and landed on the surface without being destroyed in the process. Each of those steps consumes additional propellant. When engineers run the full calculation for a crewed Mars mission with complete return capability, the total mass that must be assembled in low Earth orbit before departure reaches somewhere between 500 and 1,000 metric tons. The entire Apollo system, including the Saturn V rocket, the command module, the service module, and the lunar module, had a mass of approximately 3,000 metric tons at launch, but the payload actually sent toward the moon was far less. A fully fueled Mars return mission would require 10 to 20 times the payload mass that Apollo sent moonward, and no rocket currently in existence or near-term development can deliver anything approaching that figure in a single launch. The solution that presents itself at this point sounds reasonable on first hearing. Launch the components separately on multiple smaller rockets and assemble them in orbit before departure. This approach, known as orbital assembly or propellant depot architecture, appears in numerous Mars mission proposals and is technically plausible in principle. The difficulty reveals itself when you count the actual number of launches required. To accumulate 500 to 1,000 metric tons of propellant and hardware in low Earth orbit, using the most capable rockets currently available or likely to exist within the next decade, requires dozens of separate launch operations. Each individual docking and transfer maneuver in orbit is a complex, time-sensitive procedure with its own failure modes. Each one must succeed completely before the next can proceed. If one launch delivers its payload to the wrong orbit, or one docking maneuver fails, or one propellant transfer leaks more than it delivers, the entire assembly sequence is compromised. The mission that looked manageable when broken into pieces becomes in practice an extraordinarily fragile chain where any single broken link collapses everything that depends on it. Independent cost analyses from research institutions and aerospace consultancies, working from engineering requirements rather than aspirational estimates, place the price tag for a single, fully capable, crewed Mars round trip between $100 billion and more than $500 billion. To place that range in context, the entire annual budget of NASA is approximately $25 billion. The upper end of that estimate represents more than 20 years of NASA's total budget spent on one mission, carrying one crew making one attempt. When you hear the figure of $500 billion attached to a single Mars round trip, does it feel less like a budget line and more like the universe, setting a price deliberately designed to be refused. But physics is not purely punishing. Buried inside the problem is a solution, one that is genuinely elegant, conceptually brilliant, and practically terrifying in the specific ways it can fail. It does not eliminate the danger. In certain scenarios, it concentrates the danger into a single point of failure, where everything depends on a machine operating alone on another planet with no human hands available to fix it if something goes wrong. The idea itself is clean and logical, in a way that deserves genuine admiration before the complications are examined. Mars has an atmosphere composed of approximately 95% carbon dioxide. Mars also has water ice locked in its soil, confirmed by multiple robotic missions over several decades of exploration. Water can be split into hydrogen and oxygen through electrolysis, a process requiring electrical power but no exotic materials or conditions. Hydrogen, combined with carbon dioxide through a well-understood chemical process called the Sabatier reaction, produces methane and water. The water feeds back into the electrolysis step, closing the loop. The methane is rocket fuel. The oxygen is the oxidizer that burns with it. Both can be produced on Mars from materials already present on Mars using equipment brought from Earth. This concept is called in situ resource utilization, and it is the reason SpaceX chose methane as the propellant for Starship rather than the liquid hydrogen used by earlier heavy-lift vehicles. That choice was not made for atmospheric reasons or marketing considerations. It was made because methane can theoretically be manufactured on Mars, which means a Starship that lands on Mars might eventually be refueled there without requiring propellant shipped from Earth. The strategic logic is sound. If it works, it changes the economics of the return journey fundamentally. NASA has already demonstrated the underlying chemistry in a Martian environment. The MOXIE experiment, a device roughly the size of a car battery that flew aboard the Perseverance rover, successfully extracted oxygen from Martian atmospheric carbon dioxide. The experiment produced oxygen on Mars for the first time in history. It was a genuine scientific achievement and an important proof of concept. MOXIE produced approximately 10 grams of oxygen per hour during its operational periods. A crewed Mars mission requires tens of metric tons of propellant for the return journey. Converting 10 grams per hour into the tens of thousands of kilograms needed for a human return flight requires a system that outperforms MOXIE by a factor of millions, operating not for brief experimental sessions but continuously across months or years, without maintenance, without spare parts, delivered on demand, and without human intervention of any kind. This is where the plan's elegance meets the specific texture of its danger. The fuel production equipment cannot travel with the crew. The timeline does not permit it. To have propellant ready when the crew needs it, the production system must be landed on Mars and begin operating at least 2 years before the crew departs Earth. The machinery sits on the Martian surface alone, running autonomously through conditions that would challenge the most robust industrial equipment ever built for Earth. Daily temperature swings of 130 degrees Celsius expand and contract every seal, every fitting, every mechanical joint in the system. Dust storms capable of covering the entire planet for months at a time reduce solar power availability to near zero for extended periods. Cosmic radiation degrades electronics continuously in ways that ground-based testing cannot fully replicate, and the system must not merely survive these conditions. It must produce propellant on schedule, in sufficient quantity, reliably enough that a crew betting their lives on the outcome can be launched from Earth with confidence in the result. If something fails, the repair crew is the crew that has not left yet. Once they depart, the situation changes completely. Follow the specific scenario that keeps mission planners awake at night. The crew has been traveling for 8 months. They are past the point where returning to Earth by reversing course is physically possible. Orbital mechanics committed them to their trajectory months ago. Then Earth receives a telemetry signal from the ISRU system on the Martian surface. The pump responsible for extracting water ice from the soil has failed. Propellant production has stopped. Current fuel reserves on Mars are sufficient for approximately 30% of the quantity needed for the return journey. There are no spare parts that can reach Mars in time. The fastest possible resupply mission requires 8 months of transit in each direction, plus months of preparation before launch. The crew cannot turn around. They continue toward Mars, toward a surface where the machinery they depend on for survival has already announced its failure. They will arrive to a situation they must solve with whatever tools and materials they carried with them, without external support of any meaningful kind on a timeline determined by how long their consumables last. This is the fundamental difference between a Mars mission and every human spaceflight that preceded it, and no amount of careful mission design eliminates it entirely. Apollo 13 suffered a catastrophic equipment failure on the way to the Moon and returned its crew safely to Earth because the Moon is 3 days away, and the physics of the return trajectory remained accessible. The International Space Station has experienced equipment failures throughout its operational life, and in every case, replacement components arrived on the next resupply flight within weeks. The Mars crew has neither of those options. The distance converts every equipment failure from a problem with a solution into a problem that must be solved entirely from within or not solved at all. There is no abort mode once the journey begins. There is no mission control intervention that arrives in time to matter during any acute crisis. There is no rescue flight that reaches Mars before the situation has already resolved itself one way or another. What the crew carries is what they have. What the equipment on the surface does before they arrive determines whether the return trip exists at all. Would you board that spacecraft knowing that your return home depends entirely on an autonomous machine that has never been tested at operational scale, running alone on another planet tens of millions of kilometers beyond any possibility of repair? And even if the ISRU system functions perfectly, even if the tanks are full and the return vehicle is ready and every system is green across every display, there is still a third threat. It is not in the machinery. It is not outside the hull. It has been present since the moment of departure, working quietly and continuously inside the body of every person on the crew, and it began accumulating damage from the first day they left the protection of Earth's magnetic field. Scott Kelly landed in Kazakhstan in March of 2016 after 340 days aboard the International Space Station. He was a career astronaut, one of the most experienced in NASA's history, physically prepared for the return in every way that current medical science knows how to prepare a human being. When the Soyuz capsule touched down and the recovery team opened the hatch, Kelly could not walk without assistance. His bones ached in a way he described as feeling broken from the inside. His skin, after nearly a year without direct contact with ordinary air and surfaces, burned and itched when touched as though the atmosphere itself had become an irritant. His feet, softened from months without the pressure of walking under gravity, could barely tolerate contact with the ground. That was after 340 days. A Mars mission requires a minimum of 3 years. The human body is not a fixed object. It is a system in continuous negotiation, with its environment constantly rebuilding itself in response to the specific demands that environment places upon it. Over millions of years of evolution on Earth, that environment included one consistent and inescapable feature: a gravitational field pulling downward with a force calibrated precisely to the mass of this planet. Every bone in the human skeleton, every chamber of the heart, every mechanism of the inner ear that maintains balance was shaped by that force. Remove it, and the body does not hold its form. It begins methodically and without pause to dismantle the structures it no longer perceives as necessary. Bone loss in microgravity proceeds at a rate of approximately 1 to 2% of bone mineral density per month. The mechanism is straightforward. Bone is living tissue that maintains its density in response to mechanical stress. When gravity presses a human body downward and muscles work against that force, the skeleton receives the signals it needs to sustain itself. In microgravity, those signals disappear. The body interprets the absence of stress as evidence that dense, heavy bones are an unnecessary metabolic expense, and it begins redirecting the calcium elsewhere. Astronauts aboard the International Space Station exercise for 2.5 hours every single day using resistance equipment specifically designed to simulate loading on the skeleton. Most professional athletes on Earth do not train at that intensity or duration. Despite this effort, bone loss continues. After 6 months in space, astronauts typically show bone density reductions comparable to a person in their 70s or 80s suffering from advanced osteoporosis. The transit phases of a Mars mission, the journey outbound and the return together, account for approximately 14 to 18 months in microgravity. During that interval alone, a crew member could lose 20 to 30% of their bone density. Bones at that level of depletion do not simply feel fragile, They fracture under loads that would be entirely routine for a healthy skeleton. Getting out of a chair, catching a stumble, the compressive force of landing after a small jump. Any of these ordinary movements can become a medical emergency when the structural material of the skeleton has been reduced to that degree. Here is where the biological situation becomes genuinely uncharted in a way that demands attention. Mars has a gravitational field equal to 38% of Earth's. It is the only place in the solar system other than Earth itself where a human crew might spend extended time on a solid surface with some gravitational loading on their bones. The question of whether 38% gravity is sufficient to halt or meaningfully slow the bone loss process is one that current science cannot answer because the data simply does not exist. Every measurement ever taken of bone density in astronauts comes from one of two environments: full Earth gravity on the ground or near zero gravity aboard orbiting spacecraft. Mars gravity occupies a region between those two data points where no human being has ever spent any time at all. Whether the Martian surface provides enough mechanical stimulus to preserve bone density is unknown. It may slow the deterioration. It may not slow it at all. The crew that spends 2 years on Mars will be the first human beings to generate that data using their own bodies as the experimental apparatus, with no way to act on the results if the answer turns out to be the wrong one. The cardiovascular system undergoes its own restructuring in the absence of gravity's demands. On Earth, the heart works continuously against gravity to pump blood upward to the brain. It is a powerful muscular organ shaped by that lifelong demand. In microgravity, blood redistributes toward the upper body and head without requiring cardiac effort to get there. The heart, receiving less resistance and less demand, responds the way any muscle responds to reduced workload. It weakens. Its shape changes, becoming less elongated and more spherical as the mechanical stresses that maintained its form are removed. After a 6-month mission returning, astronauts frequently experience orthostatic intolerance, a condition in which the cardiovascular system can no longer maintain adequate blood pressure when the person stands upright. Several astronauts have fainted immediately after returning to Earth, their hearts temporarily unable to perform the basic task of keeping the brain supplied with blood against the force of normal gravity. This is after 6 months. What 3 years of reduced gravitational demand does to a human heart has never been measured because no heart has experienced it. Vision loss is among the most troubling findings to emerge from long-duration spaceflight research, in part because it is permanent in a meaningful percentage of cases. Approximately 60% of astronauts who have completed extended missions report changes in their vision, ranging from mild blurring to significant shifts in visual acuity. The leading explanation involves intracranial pressure. In microgravity, cerebrospinal fluid, which normally pulls partly toward the lower body under gravity, redistributes toward the head. The increased fluid pressure in the skull appears to push against the back of the eye, gradually reshaping the eyeball and causing swelling of the optic nerve in a condition researchers have named spaceflight-associated neuroocular syndrome. Astronaut Karen Nyberg described watching her vision soften and blur progressively during her long-duration mission, a process that continued without reversal while she remained in space. Some astronauts have returned to Earth with permanently altered vision that did not fully recover even after years of rehabilitation. Losing reliable vision is not a minor inconvenience in any environment. On Mars, where every external excursion requires reading instrument displays through a helmet visor and every equipment repair demands precise manual work, degraded eyesight is a threat to the crew's ability to function and survive. Then there is radiation, which operates differently from the threats described above, because it accumulates invisibly without any sensation, and because the damage it causes cannot be undone. Earth's magnetic field deflects the constant stream of charged particles flowing outward from the Sun and from distant cosmic sources. Earth's atmosphere absorbs much of what the magnetic field does not catch. Together, these two shields reduce radiation exposure at the surface to a level that human biology has adapted to over evolutionary timescales. Astronauts aboard the International Space Station receive radiation at a rate roughly 50 to 60 times higher than people on the ground, even though the station remains within the outer edges of Earth's magnetic protection. On a trajectory toward Mars, that protection disappears entirely. The spacecraft hull provides some shielding, but galactic cosmic rays, which originate from supernovae and other high-energy events throughout the galaxy, carry enough energy to pass through meters of metal as though it were not. There, animal studies using radiation profiles that approximate deep space exposure have documented damage to the central nervous system, including measurable cognitive impairment, memory deficits, and behavioral changes. The human data at these exposure levels does not yet exist because no human has ever been exposed to them. A Mars crew would accumulate that data across 3 years, one day at a time, with the results revealing themselves not during the mission but in the years and decades that follow. What is rarely stated with sufficient directness is the implication that emerges when all of these biological changes are considered together rather than separately. A crew member who has spent 18 months in microgravity during transit and 2 years in the partial gravity of Mars arrives at the return journey with a skeleton that may have lost a quarter or more of its original density, a cardiovascular system that has been operating under reduced demand for years, eyes that have been subjected to elevated intracranial pressure across an extended period, and a cumulative radiation dose that exceeds anything previously recorded for a human being. They then board a spacecraft for 8 more months of microgravity transit. They then attempt to re-enter Earth's atmosphere, a process that subjects the crew to compressive forces several times, the strength of normal gravity applied to bones that may no longer be capable of bearing them without fracturing. And if they survive re-entry, and if the parachutes deploy, and if the capsule settles onto the surface of their home planet, the gravity that every human being is born into becomes for them a threat. Bones too thin to support body weight, a heart too deconditioned to sustain blood pressure against a full gravitational field. The planet they left as home may receive them as a hazard. If returning to Earth can place a returning crew member's body in genuine danger, does the line between being unable to return and being physiologically unable to survive, the return still carry the distinction we assumed it did? We have not yet set foot on the Martian surface. What comes next will take you inside, into the daily reality of surviving on the red planet, where the air you breathe, the water you drink, and even the person sitting beside you can each become a source of mortal danger. The most complex life support system ever built for operation in space is currently running aboard the International Space Station 400 kilometers above the surface of Earth. It recycles approximately 90 to 93% of all water consumed by the crew, drawing moisture from cabin humidity, processing urine through a multi-stage purification system, and returning the result to the drinking supply in a condition that meets or exceeds the quality standards of municipal tap water in most countries. It scrubs carbon dioxide from the air continuously. It electrolyzes water to generate breathable oxygen. It manages atmospheric pressure, humidity, and trace contaminant levels across a habitat the size of a 6-bedroom house. It is by any engineering measure a remarkable achievement, and it still requires regular resupply from Earth to keep running. Replacement filters, chemical consumables, spare parts for pumps and valves, and sensors that wear out under continuous operation. These arrive on cargo flights that dock with the station multiple times per year. When a critical component fails unexpectedly, the repair timeline is measured in weeks. The system has failed partially on multiple occasions throughout the station's operational life, and each time the solution involved either a repair, conducted with parts already aboard, or a replacement component launched from Earth on an accelerated schedule. The station has never had to solve a life support failure entirely from its own resources, with no possibility of external supply across a timeline measured in years rather than weeks. On Mars, that is the only option available. Consider what the absence of resupply actually means for the air itself. The carbon dioxide scrubbing system on a Mars habitat operates continuously every hour of every day because the alternative to continuous operation is not discomfort, it is death. Carbon dioxide accumulates in a sealed environment faster than most people intuitively expect. If the scrubbing system fails completely, the crew does not have days to diagnose and repair the problem. They have hours, not as a worst-case scenario, as a straightforward consequence of atmospheric chemistry in a sealed, pressurized volume. Every spare part, every replacement filter, every backup component for that system must either be carried from Earth in the initial cargo manifest or fabricated on Mars from available materials. If the right component was not packed, and if it cannot be improvised from what exists on site, the conversation about what to do next becomes very short. Astronaut Peggy Whitson, one of the most experienced people ever to live in space, once described the water recycling system aboard the station with characteristic directness. She noted that the coffee she drank in the morning was, in a very literal chemical sense, the processed urine of her crewmates from the day before. This was not a complaint. It was a description of engineering reality, offered matter-of-factly by someone who had made peace with the system's logic. The recycling works. The water is clean. The process is sound. On Mars, that same system must work better, run longer, and tolerate more without maintenance than any version of it has ever been asked to do aboard the station. The recycling efficiency must approach 100% rather than 93%, because losses that are acceptable when resupply arrives every few months become critical when the next delivery is not coming at all. Every percentage point of water that escapes the recycling loop is water that must be extracted from Martian soil to replace it, adding demand to yet another system that must also function without failure. Power is the thread that runs through every one of these dependencies, because nothing on Mars operates without electricity. The carbon dioxide scrubber needs power. The water recycling system needs power. The heating systems that prevent the habitat from reaching the ambient Martian surface temperature, which averages around -60 degrees Celsius and drops far lower at night, need power. The lighting that allows the crew to function and eventually to grow food needs power. The communications equipment needs power. The ISRU fuel production system needs power on a scale that dwarfs everything else. Every one of these demands is simultaneous and continuous, and the power source must be able to meet all of them without interruption across years of operation. Mars receives only 43% of the solar energy per square meter that reaches Earth. Solar panels on Mars produce less than half the output of equivalent panels in Earth orbit, and that reduced output assumes clear skies. In 2018, a global dust storm on Mars reduced sunlight at the surface to approximately 1 to 2% of normal levels for several months. The Opportunity rover, which had operated successfully for nearly 15 years on solar power, lost the ability to charge its batteries and never recovered. It was declared lost in February of 2019 after engineers exhausted every attempt to re-establish contact. Opportunity was a rover. It could afford to wait out a storm in low-power hibernation mode because its mission was scientific and its timeline was flexible. A human crew cannot enter hibernation. Their life support systems cannot be suspended until the dust clears. Food adds another layer to the dependency structure that cannot be simplified away by optimism or careful planning. Martian soil contains perchlorates, a family of chemical compounds that are toxic to plants and harmful to humans in sufficient concentrations. Growing food in raw Martian regolith is not possible without extensive chemical processing to neutralize or remove these compounds first. That processing requires equipment, energy, and water. A pressurized greenhouse requires structural integrity maintained against the pressure differential between the breathable interior atmosphere and the near vacuum outside. Artificial lighting capable of supporting photosynthesis at useful rates demands substantial electrical power on top of everything else the habitat already requires. The experiments conducted aboard the International Space Station that successfully grew small quantities of lettuce and radishes in controlled conditions were genuine scientific achievements, and they demonstrated that plants can grow in space environments under the right conditions. They did not demonstrate anything resembling the agricultural capacity needed to sustain a crew of 6 across multiple years on a planet where a crop failure cannot be supplemented by a supply delivery. If the food production system fails and stored reserves run out, the crew does not face hunger as an inconvenience. They face starvation as a terminal outcome on a timeline that Earth cannot interrupt from a distance of tens of millions of kilometers. When every breath of air, every sip of water, and every meal depends on machinery that is never permitted to fail, with no external support available and no repair timeline measured in anything less than months, what exactly do we mean when we say someone is living on Mars? Technical systems can be engineered with redundancy, with backup components, with failure modes designed to degrade gracefully rather than catastrophically. Engineers are very good at this kind of thinking, and a serious Mars mission will apply it exhaustively. But there is one system aboard any Mars habitat for which no redundant backup can be designed, no spare component carried, and no graceful degradation mode planned. That is the human mind, and on Mars it turns out to be the most fragile thing in the entire mission architecture. In 2010, 6 volunteers entered a series of interlocking modules in Moscow and sealed the door behind them. The facility, purpose-built for the Mars 500 experiment, provided 550 square meters of enclosed space. The volunteers would remain inside for 520 days, simulating the complete duration of a Mars mission, including transit and surface stay, without leaving the structure for any reason. Communication with the outside world was subject to artificially imposed delays, matching the actual signal travel time between Earth and Mars. The experiment was designed to study the psychological effects of long-duration isolation before committing human beings to the real thing. The results were instructive in ways that went beyond what the researchers anticipated. By the later months of the simulation, the majority of participants had reduced their physical activity significantly, moving less than their exercise schedules required, and spending increasing amounts of time in passive low engagement behavior. Sleep cycles drifted and fragmented, with several participants developing patterns that no longer aligned with the habitat's day and night schedule. One crew member entered a psychological state that the researchers described as similar to hibernation, becoming largely unresponsive to social interaction for extended periods, withdrawing from the group in a way that no intervention from outside the simulation could address because the study protocol required maintaining the fiction of isolation. The person was physically present, technically healthy, and functionally absent. This happened in a simulation. The participants knew on some level that mattered psychologically, that the door could be opened, the experiment could be stopped. The outside world was accessible in principle, even when it was inaccessible in protocol. That knowledge, even unspoken and consciously suppressed, provides a form of psychological anchoring that fundamentally changes the nature of the confinement. On Mars, the door cannot be opened. The outside world is not accessible in any form. The anchoring is gone. The communication delay compounds this in a way that is easy to underestimate until its daily implications are examined concretely. When Mars and Earth are at their greatest separation, a radio signal traveling at the speed of light takes approximately 24 minutes to complete the one-way journey. A crew member who wants to hear a familiar voice during a difficult moment records a message, transmits it, and waits 48 minutes for a reply, assuming the person on Earth responds immediately upon receiving it. There is no real-time conversation possible at that distance, not because of any technological limitation that future development might overcome, but because the speed of light is not a variable that engineering can adjust. The connection that human beings maintain with their support networks, with family and friends, and the accumulated context of their lives before the mission degrades into something that more closely resembles correspondence with a distant, the acquaintance than contact with people who know and love them. The emotional texture of that connection changes. It becomes thinner, more formal, slower to respond to need. Over months and years, the psychological distance between the crew and Earth grows in ways that do not correspond to the physical distance, because physical distance is fixed, while psychological distance is cumulative. Research conducted on crews in analogous environments tells a consistent story about where conflict originates in small, isolated groups. Studies of submarine crews, Antarctic winter-over teams, and participants in space habitat simulations repeatedly find that the incidents most likely to generate lasting interpersonal tension are not dramatic confrontations over significant disagreements. They are the accumulation of minor irritations that have no outlet. The sound of a particular person's breathing during sleep, a habitual gesture that becomes after the 500th repetition in a confined space genuinely intolerable. The way someone loads a shared storage area, or speaks during meals, or responds to questions with a phrasing that grates more each time it is heard. These frictions are normal in any shared living situation. On Earth, they are managed through distance, through variety of social contact, through the simple ability to spend time in different environments with different people. The friction dissipates because the situation changes. On Mars, the situation does not change. The same people occupy the same space every day. The social environment is as fixed as the physical one. There is no walking away to clear the mind, because walking away on Mars means putting on a pressure suit and going through an airlock into an environment that will kill an unprotected human being within approximately 60 seconds. The outside is not a refuge, it is an adversary. The habitat is the entire social world of everyone in it, and everyone in it must remain functional within that world, regardless of what is accumulating beneath the surface of daily interactions. The absence of any removal mechanism makes this pressure qualitatively different from anything experienced in ground-based analogues. If a crew member develops a serious psychological condition that impairs their functioning or threatens the safety of others, the options available to mission controllers on Earth are limited to advice transmitted across a communication. Delay of up to 48 minutes round trip. There is no medical evacuation. There is no facility on Mars where someone can be separated from the group and treated in a specialized environment. There is no mechanism for adding a replacement crew member or removing one who is no longer able to contribute. The group of people who departed Earth together must remain together, must continue to depend on each other for the operation of every life-critical system, must find a way to maintain functional working relationships regardless of what psychological deterioration has occurred, because the alternative to maintaining those relationships is a mission that fails in ways that are fatal for everyone. Astronauts aboard the International Space Station carry a fixed return date in their awareness throughout their missions. They know with precision when the Soyuz will take them home. That knowledge functions as a psychological anchor of considerable importance, a point of certainty in the future that organizes the experience of the present and provides a clear boundary to the duration of the hardship. Research on human endurance consistently shows that people can tolerate conditions of significant difficulty when they know the conditions are temporary. The knowledge of an endpoint changes the subjective experience of everything that precedes it. A crew on a one-way Mars mission has no return date. There is no anchor. The duration of the hardship is not bounded by a schedule. It is bounded only by life itself in an environment that is continuously trying to end it. Have you ever considered that the thing most likely to end a Mars mission might not be a technical failure at all, but an ordinary bad morning, compounded by the 18th month of isolation, compounded by the fact that there is nowhere to go? Psychology tells us that human beings are capable of enduring extraordinary hardship when they find meaning in it. But when the full accounting of what everything costs is finally brought into the open, economics will show why the only rational answer turns out to be the one that nobody wants to say out loud. Begin with a number that is already difficult to hold in the mind. The Apollo program, accounting for inflation to 2023 dollar values, cost approximately $135 billion. That expenditure put 12 human beings on the surface of the moon across 6 successful landing missions. The total time those 12 people spent conducting surface operations, moving, working, and collecting samples on the lunar surface adds up to roughly 80 hours. Divide the total cost by the total hours of human presence on the moon, and the result is approximately $1.7 billion per hour. $1.7 billion for every 60 minutes a human being spent standing on another world. And that was the moon 3 days away by spacecraft, close enough that a rescue trajectory remained theoretically available throughout every mission. Mars is not the moon scaled up. The economics reflect that distinction without softening. Independent cost analyses from NASA research centers, the European Space Agency, and aerospace policy institutions place the price of a fully capable crewed Mars round trip, carrying 4 to 6 people to the surface and returning them safely to Earth, somewhere between $100 billion and more than $500 billion. The spread in those estimates reflects genuine uncertainty about mission architecture and technology assumptions, not optimism or pessimism on the part of the analysts. The lower bound requires technological developments that do not yet exist at operational scale. The upper bound reflects more conservative assumptions about what current and near-term capabilities can realistically achieve. NASA's entire annual budget sits at approximately $25 billion. The realistic cost of a single Mars round trip therefore represents somewhere between 4 and 20 years of NASA's complete funding, spent entirely on one mission, one crew, one attempt. The one-way alternative does not simply reduce the cost at the margin, it restructures the problem entirely. A one-way mission eliminates the return propellant requirement, which, as established earlier, represents tens of thousands of kilograms of fuel that must either be transported from Earth or manufactured on Mars under conditions of complete autonomous reliability. Eliminating that requirement reduces the total mass that must be assembled in low Earth orbit before departure by a factor that changes the mission from barely conceivable to genuinely achievable with near-term technology. A one-way mission also eliminates the Earth re-entry vehicle, the heat shield rated for interplanetary return velocities, the parachute systems, the recovery hardware, and the entire redundant backup architecture required for each of those systems. When these eliminations are calculated together, the cost reduction compared to a full round trip reaches somewhere between 80 and 90%. The budget required for one round-trip mission is sufficient on a one-way architecture to send 5 to 10 separate crews to Mars. Instead of one group of 6 people visiting briefly and departing, the same money establishes the foundation of something permanent, with enough people to constitute a functional community rather than an isolated outpost. Here is where the compounding logic of the waiting trap becomes economically visible. A new launch window to Mars opens every 26 months. Each time one opens, rocket technology is marginally more capable than it was during the previous window. Computational systems are more powerful. Materials science has advanced. Life support research has produced incremental improvements. There is always at every window a rational argument for waiting until the next one, when the technology will be better and the risk will be lower. This argument is not dishonest. It is structurally correct. Technology does improve on roughly that timescale. The consequence of following that argument consistently is the 50 years that have elapsed since Apollo without a human footprint on any surface beyond the moon. Not because the engineering community lacked the desire or the theoretical knowledge, because the safety bar required for a round-trip mission is set at a level that advancing technology perpetually approaches but has not reached, and the economics of attempting it anyway have never cleared the threshold required to secure committed funding. Every window that passes with a rational reason to wait is a window that was not used. The accumulating total of unused windows is 5 decades of a species that reached the moon and then stopped. The historical comparison that reframes this most usefully is not drawn from spaceflight at all. In 1492, Christopher Columbus departed Spain without certainty about what he would find or reliable assurance of a viable return route. The funding for his expedition, translated into contemporary terms, amounted to a few $1,000,000. He did not know the distance to his destination with accuracy. He did not know whether the resources available at his destination would sustain his crew. He went anyway, because the argument for waiting until certainty was available was an argument for never going. In 1620, the passengers of the Mayflower crossed the Atlantic knowing with practical clarity that the economic and logistical barriers to returning to England were prohibitive for the foreseeable future. They did not describe their journey as a one-way trip in the language of sacrifice or tragedy. They described it as settlement because that is what it was. The framing determined the meaning. The direction of travel was a feature of the undertaking, not a flaw in the plan. The scientists and engineers who discuss one-way Mars missions are not expressing pessimism about human capability or resignation in the face of technical obstacles. They are doing arithmetic. The arithmetic produces the same result regardless of who performs it or how much they would prefer a different answer. A one-way mission is achievable with technology that exists or will exist within a realistic development timeline. A round-trip mission of equivalent safety standard is not within any budget that has ever been seriously proposed for civilian space exploration. The mathematics does not contain an ideological position. It contains a direction, and the direction is consistent. If the same sum of money that would send 6 people to Mars and back could instead send 50 people to Mars to stay and begin building the first human civilization on another planet, which of those two outcomes represents the more meaningful use of the investment? Economics has given its answer. Physics gave its answer in part 3. Biology gave its answer in part 5. Every independent line of analysis points in the same direction toward the same conclusion that the engineering community has circled for decades without stating in public with sufficient plainness. But there remains one question that arithmetic alone cannot resolve. It is the question that sits underneath all the technical analysis, the one that determines whether any of this should happen at all. And the answer to it comes from a place that is less obvious than it first appears. State the question directly, because it deserves to be met without evasion. Is it ethically acceptable to send human beings to a place they will never return from, even if they volunteer to go? The strongest version of the objection deserves full engagement before anything else is considered. Informed consent, the ethical principle that people must understand what they are agreeing to before agreeing to it, requires that the person consenting has genuine comprehension of the experience they are accepting. A prospective Mars colonist can read every technical document produced by every space agency. They can complete years of training, participate in isolation simulations, study the physiological research, and speak at length with psychologists about the long-term effects of what they are undertaking. None of that preparation can give them actual knowledge of what the third year on Mars feels like when the body is deteriorating, when the social environment has been the same 6 people for 30 months, when Earth is a faint point of light indistinguishable from the stars surrounding it. Consent given before an experience of that magnitude is consent given in a condition of fundamental ignorance about what is being consented to. How much ethical weight can it carry? This objection is serious and should not be dismissed. It is also, when examined against the historical record of human exploration, not as disqualifying as it initially appears. The Polynesian navigators who crossed the Pacific Ocean in outrigger canoes travelling toward islands whose existence they could not confirm without charts or instruments beyond their accumulated knowledge of stars and currents and bird. Migration patterns had no meaningful way to consent to the specific experience of what happened if their calculations were wrong. Many expeditions disappeared entirely absorbed by an ocean that left no record of what occurred. The ones that found land settled it because returning across thousands of kilometers of open water was not a realistic option for most of them. Their descendants became the peoples of Hawaii, New Zealand, Samoa, Tonga, and every other island culture across the largest ocean on Earth. History does not remember them as victims of inadequate consent processes. It remembers them as the greatest navigators in the history of human exploration. The data point that is harder to dismiss than any historical analogy is more recent and more specific. When Mars One, a private initiative proposing to send volunteers on a permanent one-way mission to Mars, opened its application process, more than 200,000 people submitted applications. The one-way nature of the mission was not obscured or softened in the materials applicants reviewed. It was the central premise. More than 200,000 people read that premise, understood it, and decided that it described something they wanted to do. The project itself was poorly funded and never came close to operational capability, but the applications are data about human motivation that exists independent of whether the organization behind them was credible. The desire was real. The willingness was not manufactured or induced by misleading framing. It emerged in direct response to honest disclosure. These were not people who failed to understand the implications. They were people who understood the implications and reached a different conclusion than the one their observers expected. The deeper argument for one-way missions does not rest on individual preference or historical analogy, however. It rests on a fact about Earth that is easy to state and difficult to fully absorb. Earth is not permanent. Not in the metaphorical sense of impermanence that applies to human experience, but in the literal physically precise sense that applies to planets. The catalogue of risks that could end human civilization on a compressed timescale includes asteroid impacts of sufficient size, supervolcanic eruptions capable of triggering prolonged atmospheric cooling, nuclear exchange, and pandemic events, of a severity beyond what historical experience has recorded. Each of these represents a low probability event in any given century, but low probability compounded across thousands of years of civilization produces cumulative risk that is not negligible. On longer timescales, the Sun is not a fixed object. It is a middle-aged star that will exhaust the hydrogen in its core in approximately 5 billion years to expand into a red giant, and in doing so, render Earth uninhabitable long before the expansion reaches its maximum radius. This is not speculative extrapolation. It is stellar physics applied to an object whose properties are measured with considerable precision. A species that exists on a single planet has a finite lifespan bounded by that planet's own finite lifespan, and the various catastrophes that could abbreviate it further. A species distributed across multiple planets has removed the single point of failure. The insurance value of a self-sustaining human presence on Mars is not symbolic. It is structural. It changes the extinction risk profile of the species in a way that no other investment of comparable magnitude can replicate. Framed this way, the ethical question inverts. The question may not be whether it is acceptable to send volunteers on one-way missions to Mars given that they understand and accept the terms. The question may be whether it is acceptable to decline to do so given that every analysis of the alternatives points toward continued confinement of all of humanity to a single world whose long-term survival is not guaranteed. The first framing assumes that the ethical weight falls entirely on the people departing. The second framing recognizes that staying is also a choice, with ethical consequences distributed across everyone who remains. If a future generation looks back at the 21st century and asks why humanity, having developed the technical capability to establish a presence on another world, chose instead to wait for a safer moment that the mathematics consistently showed would not arrive, what will the answer be? And here is where this story moves into territory that none of the analysis so far has addressed, because what comes next is not about the people who leave. It is about what they become after the door closes behind them, and what grows from the place where they land across timescales that make everything discussed so far look like a brief preface to the actual story. Sometime around the year 2080, in a pressurized habitat module in the Hellas Planitia Basin on Mars, a child is born. Its parents are Earth humans, people who made the journey across interplanetary space knowing they would not return. They carry Earth in their bodies, in their bone density, calibrated by decades of living under full gravitational pull in their cardiovascular systems, shaped by a lifetime of pumping blood upward against a force that does not exist herein. The same measure. They remember blue sky. They remember rain. Their child will remember neither. And more than that, the child's body will be built for a world where neither exists. This is not sentiment or speculation. It is developmental biology applied to a different gravitational environment, and the implications follow from the science with the same inevitability that orbital mechanics follows from the mass of planets. Bone forms in response to the mechanical loads placed upon it during growth. A skeleton developing under 38% of Earth's gravitational pull does not receive the same signals that drive the density and structural architecture of bones formed on Earth. The resulting skeleton is not defective. It is optimized for the environment in which it developed. It is lighter, structured, differently calibrated to support a body that will spend its life in gravity that asks less of it. The cardiovascular system follows the same logic. A heart that develops in an environment where blood requires less force to reach the brain from birth onward will be a different heart than one that has spent decades working against Earth's gravitational field. The muscular system, the proportions of the body, the length of the spine, uncompressed by a gravitational field, it was not designed to accommodate. All of these will differ in ways that are not cosmetic but functional. The child born in Hellas Planitia in 2080 is in the biologically meaningful sense of the phrase, not an Earth human. It is the first Martian. Now follow what that means if this child ever attempts to visit the planet where its parents were born. Earth's gravitational pull is 2.6 times stronger than Mars. A body calibrated for Martian gravity, arriving in Earth gravity, does not experience modest discomfort or an adjustment period measured in weeks. The skeleton built for a lighter load encounters forces it was never structurally prepared to bear. The cardiovascular system, developed to move blood against a weaker downward pull faces, demands it cannot meet with the efficiency required to sustain normal function. The musculature proportioned for movement in conditions that placed less demand on it finds itself inadequate for the simplest tasks that Earth humans perform without thought. In moderate scenarios, the result is severe disability. In more extreme scenarios, depending on the degree of physiological divergence and the individual's specific development, the result is organ failure. Earth, the ancestral home of every human being who ever lived before this child, is a planet that could kill it within days of arrival. The planet that humanity has spent its entire existence on becomes, for the first generation born elsewhere, a lethal environment. This is not a distant hypothetical framed in the comfortable abstraction of the very far future. If human beings reach Mars in the decade of the 2040s or 2050s, which represents the more optimistic end of currently discussed timelines, the first children born on Mars could appear before the year 2070. those individuals are potentially alive within the current century. The biological divergence between Earth-born humans and Mars-born humans is not a question for some remote era of science fiction. It is a question for a timeline that overlaps with the lives of people who exist today. The genetic dimension of a Mars colony introduces a separate constraint that mission planners rarely discuss with sufficient frankness. A founding population of 6 people does not contain enough genetic diversity to sustain a healthy, multi-generational community. The mathematics of population genetics is unambiguous on this point. With 6 founders, the effective population size is small enough that genetic drift, the random fluctuation of allele frequencies across generations, begins to reduce diversity within a relatively small number of generations. Deleterious recessive traits that are harmless when rare in a large, diverse population become more common as the population becomes more inbred. The minimum founding population required to maintain genetic health across many generations without active management is a subject of ongoing research, but estimates from population geneticists range from several hundred to more than 500 individuals. Some analyses suggest that even larger founding populations are preferable if the colony is intended to be self-sustaining over centuries. What this means practically is that a Mars colony cannot be a single historic event. It must be an ongoing commitment, a continuous flow of new arrivals across multiple decades, each mission adding genetic diversity and new skills to a community that cannot afford to become isolated in any dimension. The biological health of the colony depends on Earth's sustained engagement with it across a timescale that outlasts any individual political administration or funding cycle. If a child born on Mars in 2080 cannot travel to Earth, cannot visit the planet that shaped every generation of its ancestry, cannot stand under an open sky or feel rain on its face, or experience the gravity that built the human body over millions of years of evolution, is that a limitation imposed on it by circumstance? Or is it simply the defining condition of what it means to be the kind of being it is? When 2 populations of human beings exist in different gravitational environments, developing different physiological characteristics across generations, accumulating different lived experiences and cultural frameworks diverging in ways that biology, not choice, enforces the question of what connects them, becomes genuinely complicated. They share a species designation, a common ancestry, a history that begins on Earth. But the forces shaping them are different in ways that compound with every generation. What they become over time may be something that the word human captures less and less precisely. When the 2 populations of humans, one shaped by Earth and one shaped by Mars, grow increasingly different in biology, in culture, in how they understand the universe they both inhabit, one question becomes impossible to avoid much longer. Are they still the same species? And who exactly has the authority to decide? Place yourself 150 years after the first human landing on Mars. The Martian population has grown to several tens of thousands. 3 or 4 generations have been born on the red planet people, for whom Mars is not a destination or an achievement or a sacrifice, but simply the ground beneath their feet and the only sky they have ever known. The languages they speak descend from whatever Earth tongues the original colonists carried with them. But they have evolved in the way that all languages evolve when a population is isolated and confronted with experiences that existing vocabulary cannot capture. New words exist in Martian speech for things that have no equivalent on Earth. There are words for the specific quality of light during a Martian sunset, when dust particles suspended in an atmosphere 100 times thinner than Earth's scatter sunlight into hues that no terrestrial sky produces, pink, bleeding, into violet at the horizon, while the sun shrinks to a size that Earth observers would find disorienting. There are words for the emotional experience of locating Earth in the night sky, a pale blue point of light, indistinguishable to casual observation from the other stars, and knowing that it is the place every ancestor came from, but that your own body would not survive visiting. There are words for the particular silence of a dust storm building on the horizon, for the way the already dim light falters and the temperature drops before the wall of suspended iron oxide arrives. These are not translations of Earth concepts. They are genuinely new categories of experience that required new language, because nothing in the inherited vocabulary was adequate. The political fracture that this divergence eventually produces is not a dramatic rupture. It accumulates the same way that all the other separations accumulate gradually through the daily reality of lives lived entirely outside the framework that Earth governance was designed to address. A person born on Mars in the year 2100 has no practical connection to the legislative bodies of Earth nations. They did not vote in any Earth election. The decisions made by the United States Congress, or the European Parliament, or the National People's Congress of China do not govern their daily existence in any way that corresponds to how governance normally operates. Laws derive their legitimacy from the consent of the governed, from the shared membership of a community in the political structures that regulate it. A Martian-born population that has never been part of any Earth political community that faces entirely different material conditions, different resource constraints, different existential risks, has a reasonable claim that Earth law has no natural authority over it. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967, the foundational document of international space law, prohibits nations from claiming sovereignty over celestial bodies, including Mars. It was written by and for a world in which space was explored by governments, sending representatives on temporary missions, not by a world in which people were born on other planets and considered them home. The treaty contains no framework for the governance of a permanent, multi-generational population on Mars, because no one in 1967 was seriously planning for that contingency. The legal vacuum that results is not a minor administrative question. It is a structural absence at the foundation of whatever relationship Earth and Mars develop over the coming centuries. The biological divergence described in the previous part does not stop at the first generation. Over timescales of several hundred years, the differences between Earth-born and Mars-born humans accumulate through multiple mechanisms simultaneously. Genetic drift operates on the Martian population, which remains smaller and more isolated than any Earth population, causing allele frequencies to shift in ways that would not occur in the larger gene pool on Earth. Natural selection operates differently on Mars, where the specific physiological demands of the environment and the specific pathogens present, the specific nutritional constraints, and the specific stresses of life in a pressurized habitat create selection pressures that do not exist on Earth. Epigenetic effects, the heritable changes in gene expression that result from environmental conditions experienced across generations, add another layer of divergence that operates faster than genetic mutation. None of these processes individually produce dramatic change within a human lifetime. Together, across centuries, they produce populations that are measurably different in ways that transcend culture and language. They are not different species. Speciation in sexually reproducing organisms requires tens of thousands of years of complete reproductive isolation, and Earth and Mars will not be reproductively isolated in that absolute sense, but they are diverging populations in a way that is biologically real, not metaphorical. The communication structure between the two worlds imposes its own form of separation on every interaction. Even at closest approach, when Earth and Mars are separated by approximately 54 million kilometers, a radio signal requires roughly 3 minutes to travel one way. A conversation with a minimum round-trip delay of 6 minutes is manageable if awkward, but closest approach occurs once every 26 months. At their greatest separation, the one-way signal travel time reaches approximately 24 minutes, producing a round-trip delay of approximately 48 minutes. Any communication between the two planets exists somewhere within that range. There are no real-time conversations possible across that interval, not as a temporary technical limitation, but as a permanent physical constraint. Every diplomatic exchange, every trade negotiation, every response to a crisis, every expression of solidarity or disagreement must travel across a delay that makes the rhythm of human interaction unrecognizable. The relationship between Earth and Mars will structurally resemble 18th century correspondence between distant continents more than it resembles any form of communication that people living today would recognize as normal. A Martian of the third generation stands outside the habitat dome during a scheduled EVA, looks up at the night sky, and finds Earth. It is not difficult to locate if you know where to look. A blue-white point slightly different in color from the surrounding stars, steady rather than twinkling, because it is bright enough to resolve past the slight atmospheric shimmer of Mars. This person's grandparents made the journey from that point of light. They gave up everything that point of light represented in order to stand on the ground where their grandchild now stands. The grandchild has read about Earth, studied its history, watched recordings of its oceans and forests and cities. Earth is the most documented place in the grandchild's education and the least accessible place in their physical reality. It is origin without the possibility of return. It is home in the ancestral sense and entirely foreign in every experiential sense. Who are these people? Are they humans who happen to live on Mars? Are they Martians who happen to share DNA with Earth humans? Are they something that neither category captures accurately? Something that the vocabulary of a single planet, species, is not yet equipped to describe? If the people of Ka, Mars 200 years from now, declare that they are no longer Earth humans in any politically or biologically meaningful sense, that the divergence has become real enough to constitute a genuine distinction, what standing does anyone on Earth have to disagree? That question leads to the last thing this story has to say, and it may be the most important. Not about the people who left, about what their leaving actually meant and what it will mean across the full sweep of time that follows the moment the door closed behind them. For 11 parts, this story has been told from a particular vantage point. It has been told from Earth looking outward, from the perspective of the people who remain watching others depart toward a horizon they will never return from. From that vantage point, the dominant emotional register is loss. The physics is brutal. The biology is unforgiving. The psychology is harrowing. The economics force a conclusion that nobody wanted to reach. Everything about the journey examined from the position of those who stay behind carries the weight of sacrifice and severance. Something is being given up. Someone is not coming home. The door closes and does not reopen. But there is another vantage point that this story has not yet inhabited fully. The vantage point of the people on the ship. Ask a different question now, after everything that has been established. Not what do those departures look like from Earth? What do they feel like from inside the vessel that is leaving? The history of human migration offers a truth that tends to get lost when the conversation focuses on what was left behind rather than what was found. The majority of the great human migrations in recorded history produced people who did not return, not primarily because they could not, but because the new place became the real place. The Vietnamese families who resettled in the United States after 1975 included many individuals who never went back to Vietnam, not because the journey was impossible because it eventually became possible, but because the life built in the new country became the actual life. The children born in America did not experience their parents' country of origin as a lost home. They experienced it as part of a family story, important, formative, worthy of respect, but not the ground beneath their own feet. Their children, the grandchildren of the people who left, grew up without the particular ache of displacement because displacement was not their experience. Home was simply where they were. The sense of something missing did not transfer across that generation. What transferred instead was the fact of being somewhere. Mars will operate according to the same psychological logic, but at a scale and with a permanence that no previous migration has approached. The biological irreversibility described in the preceding parts is precisely what makes it different from every other departure in human history. When the Irish left for America during the famine years of the 1840s, the impossibility of return was economic and practical, real in every meaningful sense, but not written into their physiology. They could have gone back under different circumstances. The Mars colonists cannot under any circumstances that physics permits. Their bodies close the door behind them as surely as the distance does. That permanence, which looks from Earth like the harshest feature of the undertaking, looks from inside the ship like something else entirely. It looks like commitment in its purest form. The kind that removes the option of retreat and therefore removes the ambivalence that retreat makes possible. Consider a specific moment. A woman born on Mars in the year 2075. Her grandmother was among the first crew to land on the Martian surface in 2047. One of the small group of people who stepped out of a pressurized airlock onto ochre dust and became in that moment the first humans to stand on another planet. The grandmother never returned to Earth. She built a life in the habitat modules, contributed to every system that kept the early colony alive. She watched the population grow from 6 to 60 to several hundred as subsequent missions arrived across the following decades. She died on Mars. She is buried in whatever form Martian burial takes in the planet she chose. Her granddaughter has never seen a blue sky. Not in person, not in the way that blue sky actually looks when you are standing beneath it with your eyes open and your skin in contact with the air beneath it. She has seen recordings. She has seen photographs taken by the original colonists before departure images of Earth's sky in conditions ranging from clear summer mornings to the bruised purple of approaching storms. She knows what blue sky is. She will never know what it feels like to be inside it. She has never heard rain. She has never felt wind that was not artificially circulated through a habitat ventilation system. She has never walked on ground that did not require a pressure suit to stand on safely. She never looked at a horizon without the knowledge that what lies beyond it is an environment hostile to her unprotected existence. But she knows exactly what the Martian sunset looks like when the dust suspended in the thin atmosphere catches the weakened light of a sun that appears 2/3 the size it would from Earth, and the sky along the horizon shifts through colours that no terrestrial atmosphere produces in quite that combination. She knows the specific silence of the habitat at 3 a.m. when the life support systems cycle into a lower operational mode, and the only sound is the faint mechanical breath of the air recyclers doing their continuous work. She knows the weight of her own body in gravity that asks less of her than Earth gravity would, the particular ease of movement that her musculature was built for. She knows the smell of the greenhouse module where food grows under artificial light, the particular green density of plants thriving in processed Martian soil, the satisfaction of a harvest that represents real calories produced by real labour in a real place. That is her home, not because she has no alternative, because it is the only reality she has ever inhabited, and she loves it with the uncomplicated directness that people love the places that formed them. Her grandmother did not lose Earth when she left it. She gave Mars to a granddaughter who would not otherwise have existed in a place that would not otherwise have been inhabited, building something that would not otherwise have been built. The gift was not the sacrifice of departure. The gift was everything that departure made possible. This reframes the central question of this entire story in a way that changes what the question actually is. The story has been framed from its opening around why the people who go to Mars will never come back. That framing assumes the primary fact worth understanding is the impossibility of return. But return is only the relevant metric if departure is conceived as a temporary condition, if going somewhere is understood as a prelude to coming home. When departure is the permanent establishment of a new home, the absence of return is not the story. It is a feature of a different story entirely, the story of what is being created, rather than what is being left behind. When the door of the spacecraft seals for the last time, and the engines ignite, and Earth begins its recession, from a living presence to a visible object, to a bright point of light, to an unremarkable star in a crowded sky, the people inside that vessel are not experiencing the feeling of losing something. They are experiencing what every generation of genuine pioneers in human history has experienced at the moment of irrevocable departure. The particular clarity that comes when ambivalence is no longer possible. The settling of purpose that occurs when the option to turn back has been removed, not by force but by choice. They are exactly where they decided to be, doing exactly what they came to do. The door is closed. The work begins. 70,000 years ago, the ancestors of every human being alive today began leaving Africa. They had no maps. They had no certainty about what lay beyond the familiar terrain. They had no guarantee of survival in the new environments they were moving toward, and no assured route back to the place they had come from. The people who remained in Africa watched them go, and could not have known in any terms that would be meaningful to us today what those departures would eventually produce. Today, the entire inhabited surface of the Earth is the answer to what those departures produced. Every language, every civilization, every piece of music ever composed, and every scientific discovery ever made by a human mind is the consequence of a series of one-way journeys taken by people who had no way of knowing how consequential their departure would turn out to be. The story of Mars is the next chapter of that same story. Not a departure from human history, but a continuation of its oldest and most defining pattern. The species that cannot stay in one place, that keeps moving toward horizons it cannot see past, that repeatedly chooses the unknown over the familiar, when the familiar has been fully inhabited. We are the descendants of the people who left, and the people who stayed. Both lines of that ancestry are present in everyone alive today. The Martian story will produce the same bifurcation, people who go and people who remain. And 500 years from now, both populations will be the inheritors of a choice made in the early decades of the 21st century when humanity first seriously confronted the question of whether to remain a single planet species. If 500 years from now, a child on Mars looks toward Earth the way we look toward Africa, knowing it as the place of ultimate origin, the ground from which everything eventually came, and feels gratitude toward the people who made the first crossing and did not come back, was the one-way journey a sacrifice? Or was it the greatest gift one generation has ever given to the ones that followed, the gift of a world, a future, and a home that did not exist until someone chose to make it one?